Hey everyone, thanks for joining. I'm excited to welcome you to the very first edition of a new series I'm calling 4-Minute Gardening Tips. In this series, I will give you gardening tips in 4 minutes. It's in the name, 4-Minute Gardening Tips. Today we're going to talk about asparagus. Let's go. Now sometimes it can feel like a little bit of a guessing game as to when to cut back your asparagus and when it's truly gone dormant. The easiest way to tell, frankly, is if it just looks dead. This bit here still has a good bit of yellow and even some green. I'm going to wait maybe another couple of weeks, or I'll even let these sit around and hang out and cut them back in the early spring. Now this is what you're looking for. This is when you know that they're ready. These can be cut back because they've pushed all of the carbohydrates that they stored up down into the crowns. There's no more work to be done, so we can cut these back with confidence that we're not going to hurt next year's harvest. There are a couple different ways to go about cutting back your asparagus, depending on what you're getting after. If it's late fall or early winter, and you're ready to cut back everything, you can use long garden shears and just kind of broadly cut everything down. If you want to be a little bit more precise about it, then I would just use small pruning shears so you can get to one plant at a time. One thing that I wouldn't recommend is to use long garden shears in the early spring, because again, you don't want to interrupt the new growth. And if you end up cutting off the tips of the new spears as they're emerging, you're going to get less asparagus that season. You also want to be careful about where on the plant you're cutting. You don't want to go too low because you don't want to accidentally hit the crown and disrupt some things below the ground. But you also don't want to go too high. If you go too high, you're leaving more dead material above the ground that is susceptible to rot. And what you definitely don't want to happen is you don't want rot to permeate your plant and push down into your crown and mess things up for you. Generally speaking, you're going to want to leave about an inch above the ground. Now once you cut things back, you might notice that it looks like there's still a little bit of life where you cut the stems. Now no need to worry, this is just a timing thing. You didn't mess things up, it's not going to hurt the plant. These ferns had properly died back before we pruned them. You might find as you're cutting things back that some of the ferns have little red berries on them. Now these red berries come only from the female plants, and what it means is that the flowers on those female plants were fertilized. Now a cool thing that you can do, and an experiment that I encourage you to try, is to remove some of these berries and harvest the seeds. Plant the seeds in a little bit of soil and see if they grow. Now if you get growth, it's going to take some time before you can get some asparagus out of it. That's why typically people are planting crowns and not sowing asparagus from seed. But give it a shot. See what happens. Again, if you get some successful asparagus plants out of these seeds, you're talking about decades of harvest. Another reason you might want to cut things back in the late fall as opposed to waiting until the spring is if you had any signs of asparagus beetles. Asparagus beetles will wreak havoc on your asparagus patch, and the adults actually emerge from the ground around October or November. And then what they do is they hide out in the foliage. So they'll hang out in the patch, and then they'll lay their eggs in the spring. Those eggs will hatch, and the larvae will eat your ferns all throughout the summer. So if you had any sign of asparagus beetles, or the area that you live in is prone to having them, you might want to seriously consider cutting things back in the fall or winter so you don't create a home for these pests and give them shelter until next spring. One of the things that I'm going to do this year, because I'm looking forward to harvest next year, is I'm going to experiment. So I'm only going to cut back half of this patch. The other half, I'm going to keep it until spring. And then I'm going to determine what works best for me. And that's what I recommend that you do in your own garden. And once everything is cleared out, you're going to see exactly where your crowns are. You're going to see how well your plants have been establishing, and you can get excited for next year.